invitation to present some of my research. I'm also going to talk a bit about vegetarian nutrition, so there is some overlap with Dr. Williams' talk, but hopefully it's not too much. So first of all, what's a vegetarian? Vegetarian is somebody who doesn't eat meat or fish, and then you have different types of vegetarians, like the ovo-vegetarians who eat dairy and eggs, and lacto-vegetarians who eat dairy but no meat, fish or eggs, and then you have vegans who eat no animal products. And as you probably know, the major causes of death in the US and also here in UK and Europe and generally in high and middle income countries are heart disease, stroke and cancer. And if you add diabetes to those, you have approximately 2/3 of all the premature deaths. Some of the first studies that were done on vegetarian diets is from a pooled analysis of 5 studies from the US, here in the UK, and also from Germany. So what they found was that vegetarians, they have a 34% lower risk of ischemic heart disease death compared to the regular meat eaters. And then you have the semi-vegetarians, that means people who eat meat less than once a week, they have a 22% reduction in heart disease mortality. There were reduced risk of heart disease in vegetarians. Could be both due to a higher intake of plant foods, also that they avoid meat, and also it could be due to a generally healthier lifestyle and non-vegetarians. One of the first studies that were published on meat intake and ischemic heart disease mortality was from the Adventist mortality study. And in that study they found a dose-response relationship between higher intake of meats and higher risk of heart disease death. So those with the highest intake, they had about a 60% increased risk of dying from ischemic heart disease. So this is probably related to the lower risk in vegetarians and vegans. Is probably related to lower cholesterol, total cholesterol, and lower LDL cholesterol in the vegetarian and vegan groups. And but there is not so much difference if you look at the HDL cholesterol across the dietary groups. Dr. Williams already talked about this study, so I'm not going to go so much into detail, but the lifestyle heart trial showed that vegetarian diets can be used to treat people with already established heart disease as well. And what they found was that people who were put on a vegetarian, low-fat vegetarian diet, they had more than 90% reduction in the frequency of chest pains, while those in the control group on a standard step 2 diet, they had an actually big increase in the frequency of chest pains. And those in the vegetarian, who were put on a vegetarian diet, also had a reduction in the duration and severity of chest pains. And this is from a different study, but it also shows how the stenosis is disappearing after people are put on a vegetarian diet. So there are also some studies that Dr. Williams already presented a bit on this, but there are also some studies that have looked at vegetarian diets and mortality. And this is from the Adventist Health Study. And one interesting thing about this population is that most of the Adventists, they don't smoke or drink, so you avoid confounding that is typically brought up as an issue in nutritional epidemiological studies. At least from those two factors. And what they found here was that the vegetarians and the vegans, they had a slightly lower risk of all-cause mortality, and particularly in the men, there was a clear reduction in risk of all-cause and ischemic heart disease and CVD mortality. When they investigated specific causes of mortality, also other causes of mortality, they also found reduced risk of mortality from kidney disease and endocrine diseases, which is largely diabetes. There's also a few studies that have been done here in the UK, and one of them is the EPIC Oxford study. And if you look at the bottom here, they don't really find that much difference in all-cause mortality between vegetarians and non-vegetarians. They found, however, a lower risk of pancreatic cancer mortality and lymphatic and hematopoietic cancers, and a slightly lower cancer mortality risk. However, it's possible that people may have changed their diets during the follow-up, and actually they did a secondary analysis where they excluded the people who changed their diets, and when they during the follow-up, and when they did that, they actually found a 10% reduction in risk of all-cause mortality in the vegetarians. And for cancer, there was a significant, nearly 20% reduction in cancer mortality. So it seems that the dietary changes can have quite a big impact on the results you get. And if you don't take that into account, you can get some bias in the results. In the EPIC Oxford, they also looked at vegetarian diets and cancer incidence, meaning new cancers. So here they find also a 10% reduction in cancer incidence, and this is mainly due to reduced risk of lymphatic and hematopoietic cancers, but they also find a reduced risk of stomach cancer. And a few other cancers there are suggestive reductions in risk, but it's not statistically significant. In the Adventist Health Study, they've also looked at vegetarian diets and cancer incidence, and overall there is a 8% reduction in risk among the vegetarians. When they look at different types of vegetarians, especially the vegans have a lower risk, with 16% reduction in cancer risk. This is from the NIH AARP Diet and Health Study. Sorry if it's a lot of numbers here, but I just wanted to show the results because it's quite interesting. They've looked at red and processed meat and specific causes of mortality, and what's been if you look at the nutritional research that's been done to date, much of the research has focused on cardiovascular disease, cancers, and diabetes, but now there are studies coming out showing relations with other causes of death and other diseases as well, and this study is a good example of that. Because they found, when they looked at red and processed meat and mortality, they found increased risk of all-cause mortality, mortality from cancer, heart disease, respiratory disease, strokes, diabetes, infections, kidney disease, liver disease, and also other causes or unknown causes of death. No relation was found with Alzheimer, and they found similarly increased risk both for processed meat and unprocessed red meat. So. What I think is interesting here is that some of the strongest relations were observed for respiratory disease and liver and kidney disease, which are conditions that have not been studied much in relation to diet before. So now I'm going to go over to some of my own projects. So over the last couple of years, we published a few meta-analyses on plant foods and their relation with mortality. And first I'm going to show you the results for whole grains. And as you know, whole grains contain all the parts of the grain, the endosperm, the germ, and the bran, while the refined grains, they have the germ and bran removed during the milling process. And so much of the nutrients are found in the germ and bran, and so when you remove the germ and bran, you remove a lot of the nutrients as well. And this is likely to have a big effect on the risk of chronic diseases as well. And this paper was published in the BMJ in 2016, and we included 64 publications with data from 45 studies out of around nearly 50,000 records that were screened. I'm not sure if you've seen such forest plots before, but this is a meta-analysis. So it's a combined analysis of many different studies that have been done. And if you look at the figure on the left side here, you have each study represented by the author name and the publication year. And then you have the relative risk and the confidence intervals on the right side. And then you have a visual representation of the relative risk and the confidence interval. So squares represent the relative risk, and the confidence intervals are represented by the lines through the squares. And the bigger squares are the bigger studies. They have less variability, and the smaller studies, they have smaller squares and larger confidence intervals. So what we do is, in the meta-analysis, we make like a weighted average, basically, of all the available studies. And at the bottom, you can see like a summary estimate of the overall association. So there was a 19% reduction in risk for each 90 grams per day increase in whole grain intake. So that's equal to 3 slices of whole grain bread. When we looked at the dose-response relationship, we found a stronger relation between increasing intake and lower risk at the lower levels of intake, but some further reduction in risk up to around 7 or 7.5 servings per day. For stroke, in the middle, we found no relation in the linear dose-response analysis, but those clear evidence of non-linearity, and most of the benefit was observed up to around 100 or 150 grams per day. And for cardiovascular disease overall, the reduction in risk was strongest at the lower levels of intake. So we also looked at other causes of that. For cancer mortality, we found a linear reduction in risk with higher whole grain intake. For studies that have looked at all other causes than cancer and cardiovascular disease, we found a particularly strong reduction in risk, also linear. For all-cause mortality, there was a slightly stronger reduction in risk at lower levels of intake, but reductions in risk were observed up to around 7 servings per day, which is like 210 grams per day. So that's quite a high intake. There was also some studies that have investigated the whole grain intake in relation to other causes of that. And we found some evidence of reduced risk of respiratory disease mortality, infectious disease mortality, and diabetes mortality as well. But no relation with neurological diseases. But as you can see, the number of studies here is quite low, so we need much more data before we can make firm conclusions here. We also published a meta-analysis on nut intake and mortality, and this was published in BMC Medicine just before Christmas in 2016. And it was good timing, and we got a lot of coverage of the study. And we found a lower risk of heart disease with higher intake of nuts. Around most of the benefit was observed up to around 20 or 25 grams per day, which is like a handful of nuts. So it's a big benefit for a very small amount of food. For stroke, there was not such a clear association. There's a slight reduction in risk at very low levels of intake, but it's kind of going up a bit, but it's not significant at the higher intakes. For cardiovascular disease overall, there was also a reduced risk as well as for total cancer risk. So with a 15% reduction in risk for per 1 serving per day. For all-cause mortality, we found also a reduced risk of around 20%. And again, the most benefit was observed between 15 and 20 grams per day. When we looked at respiratory disease and diabetes mortality, we found quite strong reductions in risk as well. And there was also some evidence of a reduced risk of infectious disease mortality and for neurodegenerative diseases. But because of the small number of studies, we need much more data before we can make conclusions to these outcomes. We also made some calculations of attributable risk. So under the assumption that there is a causal relationship between nut intake and reduced mortality, we estimated that approximately 4.4 million premature deaths potentially are avoidable by increasing nut intake up to 20 grams per day in 2013. And this is for the whole world except for Africa and the Middle East, where we couldn't find data on nut intake. So next is a paper we published last year on fruit and vegetable intake and mortality, and this study also got quite a lot of media coverage. And here we included 142 publications from nearly 100 cohort studies. And what we found here was that there was this is probably too small for you to see, but I'll give you the slides later. And what we found was that there was an 8% reduction in risk for each 200 grams per day increase in fruit and vegetable intake with regard to coronary heart disease risk. And this was observed both for fruit and vegetables, and fruits and for vegetables separately. And when we looked at the dose-response relationship, we found that there was a linear reduction in risk up to 800 grams per day. And this is, one serving is 80 grams. So this is 10 servings per day, which is twice the currently recommended 5 a day. So that's probably part of the reason we got a lot of coverage. We also looked at specific types of fruits and vegetables, and here we found reduced risk of heart disease with apples and pears, with citrus fruits, with green leafy vegetables and tomatoes, as well as vitamin C rich fruits and vegetables. We also analyzed associations with stroke, and again there was a reduced risk both for fruit and vegetables combined and separately. Here there was some more evidence of a non-linear association with stronger reductions observed up to 400 grams per day, but some further reduction in risk with the higher intakes. When we, in a separate analysis, which I haven't shown here, when we looked at stroke mortality, there was actually more of a linear reduction in risk. So this is for stroke mortality and incidence combined. We also looked at total cancer risk, and the association here is much weaker. It's around 3% reduction in risk per 200 grams per day. And if you compare the higher levels of intake, there's around 13 or 14% reduction in risk for those eating around 600 grams per day compared to those who eat little or nothing. We looked at specific types of fruits and vegetables and total cancer. We found that cruciferous vegetables and yellow vegetables were the only vegetables that were associated with a reduced risk. But if you look at the numbers of studies here, it's a very low number of studies, so we need much more data before we can say this with certainty. finally, we looked at all-cause mortality as well, and here we found a 10% reduction in risk per 200 grams per day, and for all-cause mortality, we found the strongest reductions in risk up to 400 grams per day, but some further reductions in risk were also observed up to 800 grams per day. And for specific types of fruits and vegetables, we found inverse associations for apples and pears, berries, citrus fruits, as well as potatoes, green leafy vegetables, salads, cooked vegetables, and raw vegetables. But we found an increased risk with intake of tinned fruits, which is probably related to the syrups, which are often added to these fruits. Lastly, we also estimated the number of deaths that are potentially avoidable, again under the assumption that there is a causal relationship between fruit and vegetable intake and lower mortality. And we found that around 7.8 million premature deaths could be attributable to an intake below 800 grams per day in 2013. And this includes 1.3 million heart disease deaths, 2.7 million stroke deaths, and 560,000 cancer deaths. But if you sum up these numbers, you see that you get around 4.6 million deaths only. So the effect on total mortality is much bigger than what can be explained just by these causes of death. But unfortunately, there was not enough studies to analyze the association between fruit and vegetables and other causes of death. There was only one study that had looked at that time, and that's the EPIC study, and they found reduced risk of respiratory disease, digestive disease, and also other causes. So there are quite a few mechanisms that have been identified that could explain some of these findings, and they're kind of similar for most, for both whole grains and nuts and fruit and vegetables. For all these foods, we've seen that they can reduce the risk of hypertension. RCTs have shown reduced cholesterol levels, and there are also studies that have shown reduced weight gain and obesity with higher intakes of plant foods. And there are also studies that have shown benefits on the gut microbiota and less inflammation with higher intake of plant foods. For example, in the nurses' health studies and health professionals' follow-up study, there was a 11% reduction in the risk of hypertension with high fruit and vegetable intake. And there are also randomized trials which have shown that higher nut intake reduced total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, LDL to HDL cholesterol ratio, and triglycerides. And there are also studies showing reduced levels of inflammatory markers with higher nut and seed consumption. And one recent animal study showed that when you feed the mice a fiber-rich diet, and then the bacteria in the colon actually use the fiber as a source of nutrients. But when you take away the fiber, the bacteria start to break down the intestinal mucosa as a source of nutrients, and that makes make the mice more prone to infections. So that might be an explanation for why we found reduced risk of infectious disease mortality with higher intake of whole grains and nuts. As you know, in nutritional studies, it's a big challenge to get a good measurement of what people eat. Usually, when we do such studies, we use food frequency questionnaires, and so people they report how often, on average, they've eaten between 100 and 200 different food groups during the past year, and so it's easy to get a good picture for the foods that you never eat or for those that you eat often or every day. But for foods that you don't eat that often or just now and then, it might be more difficult to get a good measurement of the intake. And so in another meta-analysis, which has not yet been published, we've compared studies that have looked at a dietary intake of vitamin C and compared those and in relation to mortality, and compared those studies with other studies that have looked at vitamin C measured in blood. And because that might be a more objective measure of the exposure. And what we see here is that when we looked at vitamin C in a diet in relation to mortality, there's a nonlinear relationship with most of the reduction in risk at lower levels of intake. But when we investigated vitamin C in blood and mortality, there was a linear inverse association between higher intake of vitamin C and mortality. And similar results were observed also for carotenoids, with a nonlinear association for dietary carotenoids, while the association for carotenoids in blood is linear. So both vitamin C and carotenoids are biomarkers for fruit and vegetables. So this might mean that some of the nonlinear associations we found in the analysis of fruit and vegetables and mortality, maybe the true relationship is more linear. And also, we don't think it's vitamin C or the carotenoids themselves that are the factors that explain by themselves why fruit and vegetables reduce mortality, but because there are a lot of randomized trials which have shown not much benefit of antioxidant supplement use. So it's probably the whole package of nutrients that act synergistically to reduce the risk of chronic diseases and mortality. This is another example of how dietary changes during follow-up can affect the results you get. And I don't have a good example with regard to food changes in fruit and vegetable intake, plant foods and chronic diseases, but this one is on red meat and pancreatic cancer. And it's from the Swedish mammography cohort. And what they've done here is that they've had two measurements of dietary intake, first at baseline and then 10 years later. And then they've done different analyses using this baseline and with updated dietary assessments. And what they find here is that people with higher intake of red meat, they have a 33% increase in pancreatic cancer risk, but this is not quite significant. When they analyzed the data using both measurements, so they could take into account the dietary changes during follow-up, there was a 73% increase in pancreatic cancer risk. And later, when they analyzed those with a consistently high intake with those with a consistently low intake, there was more than 2.5-fold increase in risk. So it shows that the changes in diet can have a dramatic effect on the results we get in studies. So next I'm going to talk a bit about colorectal cancer. It's the fourth most common cancer worldwide, and there's a big variation globally with more than 40-fold variation between high and between countries with high and low cancer rates. And so this figure shows the rates in different areas of the world. So low rates in Africa and parts of South America, and intermediate rates in Europe and parts of Asia, and the highest rates in the US. There's also been done like migration studies showing what's the impact of moving from one country to another. And so here, this is a study among Japanese. First, you see the rates of Japanese in Japan, and then you see the rates of the Japanese who move to the US. So already in the first generation, they have a higher rate of colorectal cancer than their Caucasian neighbors. So this shows that it's lifestyle and diet which is the main culprits. It's not the genetics, because the genes don't change that quickly. And some of the first studies that were done on diet and cancer risk were ecological studies, where they simply plotted the level of dietary intake, in this case meat, against the colon cancer incidence on a national level. So, and they found a nearly linear association between higher meat intake and cancer risk, but colon cancer risk. But it's not a very good study design, because there's a lot of other factors that you can't take into account, and also you don't have data on individual level, so you can't draw any conclusions from such studies. There are also studies that have looked at the changes in diet and meat intake in relation to cancer, changes in cancer incidence and mortality from Japan. And there's a nearly perfect correlation between increased meat intake and colon cancer incidence 20 years later. But what we need is prospective studies which gather data on individuals, not on group level, and also which take into account various other risk factors like obesity and physical activity, smoking, and other things. And also we need meta-analysis of such studies. And this figure shows the meta-analysis of a colleague of mine on random processed meat intake and colorectal cancer risk. And it's based on a continuous update project of the World Cancer Research Fund. And it shows a 14% increase in the relative risk for each 100 gram per day increase in the random processed meat intake combined, and also increased risk for colorectal cancer separately. And there is some evidence of a dose-response relationship between higher intake and increased risk. And this is the basis for why the World Cancer Research Fund and the IARC state that there is convincing evidence that processed meat increases colorectal cancer risk, and probable evidence that red meat increases risk. And why, also the reason why there is a recommendation now to reduce random processed meat intake. So there's been a lot of theories and hypotheses about why random processed meat intake increases colorectal cancer risk. And some of the earliest hypotheses related to fat content of meats. But if you look at epidemiological studies that have looked at fat intake and colorectal cancer risk, they haven't really found much relation at all. And there has also been some theories that the cooking mutagens that are formed during high temperature cooking, like heterocyclic amines, could play a role. But there you have the problem that white meat and fish, actually there's as much heterocyclic amines formed, or even more, formed in white meat and fish than in red meat. And white meat and fish has not been that clearly related to colorectal cancer risk. So probably it's something else. More recently, there is a theory that the heme iron might be of importance, and the heme iron can actually catalyze some reactions that creates nitroso compounds in the digestive tract. And this has been shown in controlled studies where they put people on a high red meat diet, and then they measured the amount of nitroso compounds in the fishes. And then they also, when they were put on a vegetarian diet, this was reduced. They also did another experiment where they actually isolated the heme iron component from the meat and gave it as a supplement. And then the same thing happened. But when they gave inorganic iron, there was a reduction in the formation of these compounds. So that's some of the mechanisms. So now I'm going to talk a bit about overweight and obesity, and as you know, it's an increasing health problem globally, with the prevalence increasing from 3 to 6% among men and women in 1975 to 10 to 15% in 2014. And there's an increased prevalence of obesity all over the world in all geographic locations. And this is a serious problem, a health problem, because there's a really strong relation between obesity and a lot of conditions, especially diabetes. People who have obesity grade 2, they have 30 to 40 times the risk of type 2 diabetes compared to people who are lean. And there's also an increased risk of a lot of other conditions like gallstones, hypertension, high cholesterol, colon cancer, heart disease, and stroke. We've also worked on meta-analysis on BMI and cancer risk, and although it's around 12 cancers for which the evidence is either is graded either probable or convincing by the World Cancer Research Fund. But in this meta-analysis, we found that actually there is increased risk of 19 or 20 cancer types, but we don't have the mechanisms for all different cancers yet. So it might be that the evidence will be upgraded in the future and know more about the underlying biology. We also looked at maternal BMI during pregnancy and risk of pregnancy complications, and here we found an increased risk of a lot of different complications like gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, macrosomia, infections, and many other complications. We also found an increased risk of stillbirths and infant deaths with increasing maternal BMI during pregnancy. And when we look at diet and BMI, there's a meta-analysis which have shown around a 2-unit reduction in BMI among vegetarians compared to the non-vegetarians, both in men and women. And there are also studies that have looked at the relation of food groups with weight gain over time. And this is from the Harvard cohort studies. And the foods that they find are most strongly related with weight gain is potato chips, potatoes and fries, processed meats, and processed red meats. And then there is some increase in weight gain with butter, sweet desserts, refined grains, while and sugar sweetened beverages as well, and fruit juice. While foods that are related to less weight gain is nuts, whole grains, fruits, and yogurt. And all the studies that have looked at vegetarian diets and diabetes, you have the Adventist Health Study. Dr. Williams presented the cross-sectional data. Here is actual incidence data. So here they found a more than 60% reduction in risk of diabetes among the vegans, and also reductions in risk among the vegetarians and semi-vegetarians compared to the non-vegetarians. And again, there is evidence of an increased risk of diabetes with high intake of red meat and as well as processed meat, of around 20% for red meat and 40 to nearly 60% for processed meat. And for whole grains, we found a reduced risk, around 30% reduction in risk per 3 servings per day, but not much benefits beyond 3 servings for this outcome. There's also quite a few studies now that have looked at other outcomes, but for which we don't really have that much data yet. And I'm just going to go through this quickly at the end here. So there's some studies that have looked at diet and kidney stones. It's the EPIC Oxford study, which found a reduced risk of kidney stones among vegetarians and low meat eaters. And there's increased risk both with total meat, red meat, and poultry, while high fruit intake is associated with a 30% reduction in risk. For gallstones, there's a few studies, again from the Harvard group, showing a reduced risk of gallstones with high intake of fruit and vegetables, and especially green leafy vegetables. And they've also found a reduced risk of gallstones with higher intake of nuts, with a 23% reduction in risk for those eating nuts 5 or more times per week. Diverticular disease is a disease of the colon with where you have pouches formed in the colon wall, and this is due to a weakening of the muscle layer. And you can have fecal material which can cause inflammation and pain and further complications. And if you look at the prevalence of this condition among Japanese in Japan, it's only around 1% there who have it. But when they move to the States, around half of the Japanese have it. So it's a big change in a dramatic change in the prevalence. And again, there are data from the EPIC Oxford study. It's shown around a 30% reduction in risk among the vegetarians, and especially the vegans have more than a 70% reduction in risk. But there were a few cases, so the estimates are quite, confidence intervals are quite wide. And again, it's the same foods that increase the risk, red and processed meat, both associated with increased risk. Different types of fruits and vegetables like lettuce, peaches, apricots, prunes, oranges, and apples, all associated with reduced risk. For rheumatoid arthritis, we don't have that many studies yet as well, but there is the Iowa Women's Health Study that found around a 30 to 35% reduction in risk with high intake of vegetables and cruciferous vegetables. And for gout, there is one study, the health professional follow-up study, which have looked at diet and especially meat and high-protein foods, and they found a 50% increase in risk for those with the highest intake of red meat. And there was also some increase in risk with high intake of seafood, while higher intake of dairy, like skim or low-fat milk and low-fat yogurt, was associated with a reduced risk. So in summary, vegetarians appear to have a reduced risk of heart disease, diabetes, overall cancer risk, and possibly lower mortality. There is strong evidence of a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and mortality with high intake of fruits and vegetables, whole grains and nuts. And also evidence of increased risk with high intake of red and processed meat intake. There is more limited data suggesting beneficial effects of plant-based dietary patterns and plant foods and adverse effects of red and processed meat in relation to other causes of death and several other diseases. But we need much more data here, and future studies should take into account dietary changes during follow-up and also look more into the effects of measurement errors, which we know are big challenges in nutritional research. There's also a need to investigate potential effect modification by genetic risk scores and potentially underlying mechanisms. So there is also a few papers that have looked at in a broader aspect on the effects of diet and on health and healthcare costs, as well as the environmental effects of what we eat. And this study was done by Marcus Springman at the University of Oxford. And where they found that around between 5 and 8 million premature deaths could be prevented or at least delayed each year if people either reduce their red meat intake or adopted a vegetarian or vegan diet. And the healthcare costs are quite substantial as well, between 21 and 30 trillion US dollars per year globally. And they also estimated that the food-related greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced by between 29 and 70%. And this is from a Norwegian study where they looked at the greenhouse gas emissions by producing different foods. And again and again, it's the same foods that are causing a lot of environmental problems that also are related to, are causing the health problems that are also causing the environmental problems. While plant foods, in general, they have a very low environmental footprint. So, there's been some discussion about whether there should be a tax on animal foods, and especially those high-impact animal foods. It has been suggested that those foods with very high impact, both in terms of health and environment, should be taxed more, and then the plant foods which are most beneficial and also have the least environmental footprint should be taxed the least. And I think that that's probably one way to go with regard to getting more people to eat more healthily. So at last, I'd like to thank all my collaborators, and thank you for your attention.
We'll just put this mic on. Thank you very much. You've validated a lot of our food choice decisions for us. But I might just kick off with a quick question. So, have you omitted to tell us the good side of eating meat, dairy, eggs? Because there are some conflicting data about, for example, dairy seems to be protective with colorectal cancer.
Yeah,
you published that in the CUP project. So, have you cherry-picked to make us happy?
Well, not really. It was more a question of time. I could have time constraints, and we can discuss that now. There is, I think, if you look at the health effects of different foods, it's like red and processed meat is the worst, definitely. For dairy, it's kind of it's not that. It's not as bad as red and processed meat, definitely. It's for some diseases like colorectal cancer, you say, and possibly bladder and esophageal cancer, there is some suggestion of a reduced risk. While for prostate cancer and also for Parkinson, there is seems to be an increased risk. So it's kind of more towards the null, I think, if you look at total mortality and overall data it's not that clear. There are some studies that even suggest a reduced risk of mortality with dairy intake. So I think the studies are a bit all over the place actually in results for dairy. So I think we need to look at that more carefully.
Thank you for the talk. So I just have some comments about the EPIC Oxford study, and what was interesting about that. great points that you made about reduced cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality when you took out the people that had recently changed their diet. What a lot of people have said to sort of pick that apart was that the vegetarians had increased risk of colorectal cancer in this cohort with the Oxford. And when you look into the data a bit more, my understanding is that they actually had, if you compare the omnivores and the vegetarians in the Oxford study, the omnivores had a generally lower meat intake than average, and the vegetarians had a much lower fibre intake than average, or than you would assume. I think it was 18 grams a day or less, which is much less than you'd expect on a whole food plant-based kind of diet. So they had more colorectal cancer compared to the ones that ate meat, but you've told us that they've actually had less diverticular disease. So is there any way of kind of unpicking that?
Well, I think there are a few issues actually. And in an earlier publication, it's right that there was an increased risk in the vegetarians. But in the more recent data, which I've shown here, there was actually no relation between vegetarian diets and colorectal cancer. So it's basically null. And this is a bit of a puzzle. I think it was null both when I can go back and see her, but I think it was pretty much null just both before and after. But for mortality, it's both null and after, and for incidence, it's also null, pretty much null. They've done some additional analyses stratified by type of vegetarian diet, and then they see actually for colorectal cancer it's slightly higher in vegans, but for prostate cancer it's lower. And this is kind of consistent with the dairy hypothesis. Yeah, well, it's not significant for brain and the cervix. They've discussed that it might be some kind of detection bias, that vegetarians might be more health conscious and might use a screening test more frequently. So that's another problem. I don't think they've adjusted, or I'm not sure how they can take that into account, but at least they've discussed that in some of their papers. Another thing is one thing you mentioned, that the vegetarians here, they have a lower meat intake than the general population. Meat eaters have meat eaters, they have a lower meat intake than the general population. So that might be one issue, that the meat eaters are healthier than the general population. And this is also true for the Adventist health study, that the meat intake in the meat eaters is much lower. So it's all the more remarkable, I think, that you see some associations still. And it would have been interesting to look at vegetarian, because like in the AARP study, the NIH AARP study, they have it's more like a representative of the American population. So it would have been interesting to see if they actually have also a much higher meat intake among the meat eaters than in the Adventist health study. So it would have been interesting to do the same type of analysis there to see if they find stronger associations. So and it's also been discussed. I've discussed with some of my colleagues as well the findings. And one of my colleagues, she showed me a figure of the actual food intake in British vegetarians compared to the American vegetarians from the Adventist studies. And the vegetarians in the Adventist health study, they have a much higher intake of fruit and vegetables and plant foods. And while British vegetarians, they eat more unhealthier like cakes and cookies and stuff like that. So that might also be one part of the explanation why they don't see so much relation in colorectal cancer risk in British vegetarians. With regard to diverticular disease, I think there are like some diseases that are very strongly related to diet and which you'll probably see relations almost no matter what population you're going to investigate or research into. So I think diverticular disease and diabetes is typical diseases that where you find quite strong relations with diet in most populations. While with cancer is in general, the relations with diet are weaker, like for fruit and vegetables, we saw it's like 3% reduction per 200 grams of fruit and vegetables, while for cardiovascular disease it's like 8 or 10% reductions in risk. It's much stronger. So I think for cancer it's more difficult to detect associations between because they're weaker as well. So that's another issue.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. I have a question about the nut consumption.
Yeah.
You said that you talked about the benefits of the nut consumption, that we should have 20 to 25 per day.
Yeah.
Most
grams.
Yeah. Grams.
Yeah.
Not, okay.
Or between 15 and 20 if you look at all-cause mortality.
Okay. My question is, a lot of plant-based doctors, they recommend that people who have type 2 diabetes and who are overweight, they should actually reduce their nut consumption. Now, they don't give us a number, they just say reduce it. So, what is the recommendation for those people with type 2 diabetes and those people?
Well, I don't agree with that recommendation personally, because there are actually studies when we did that analysis. We also found some studies on nut consumption and risk of CVD, cardiovascular disease, in diabetics, and they show the same reduction in risk. So I don't. I wouldn't agree with such a recommendation.
So what about for weight loss? Is it the same?
You saw a slide for in relation to weight gain, I think. So nuts are actually one of the groups, food groups that are the most strongly related to lower weight gain. So I can't say for everybody. There might be individual differences between people, but in general, I think it's probably better to eat nuts than many other foods like red and processed meat or chips and stuff like that.
Thank you for the talk. What I want to ask was, you showed a number of studies saying that if you increase your fruit and veg intake, and you said much more than the recommended amount, double the amount, there was an effect on the mortality rate and also for people who have long-term health conditions and so on. Did the studies actually mention how people were taking their fruit and veg? Because the earlier speaker did recommend that juicing isn't the best way of doing it. So was there any way of the studies actually stating that?
Yeah, actually we didn't have that much data on juices and stuff like that, but and I'm not sure if you can see this here now, but we had, for the dose response analysis, we had 2 studies on juices, and there is a significant reduction in risk. So 2 studies, you can't really conclude much, but at least there is no adverse effect in relation to mortality. The other slide I showed on weight gain, there was actually increased weight gain, so there might be some differences in risk for different outcomes. So if you compare cooked and raw vegetables, for example, if then we found quite similar reductions in risk for both those preparation methods. But again, you can see it's not that many studies here, so we really should have much more data before we can conclude much, I think. Yeah. And another thing, there are studies that have shown increased diabetes risk as well with high fruit juice intake. So, like, it depends what you want. If you want to have diabetes and obesity, but reduce your mortality, that's. But of course, it's better to drink water and eat whole fruits, like for overall health. Yeah. So.
Hi. Thanks for a great, really detailed talk. Thank you. If you added up the calorie intake, so if you made your perfect diet with, perfect amount of whole grain, perfect amount of fruit and veg, perfect amount of nuts, if you added up the calorie contribution of those portions, does that take up all the calories?
I haven't made any such calculations, I can't say. Okay. But what we found was that the optimal level of fruit and vegetable intake was around 800 grams per day. For whole grains, it was around 200 grams, a bit more than 200 grams per day. For nuts, around 15-20 grams per day. So it's around a kilo. So I don't. I think that it would probably. Well, I can't say with the calories, but at least with the amount of food, I think that's getting close to the amount of in grams to what people eat per day, maybe slightly less.
Just a comment. In answer to your question, that's the diet that I eat, and I have done that calculation for me, and it's pretty close. It doesn't need much extra. It would be different for different people because I'm quite small. So someone who's a big tall guy or someone who had a very active lifestyle could give a more, but for me it is pretty good.
Great, thank you very much. Well, if there's no further questions, we'll say another big thank you to Dagfinn for taking the time this evening. And for the medical people in the room, if you want your CPD certificate, it will be given out at the back of the registration desk.